Good morning, everybody. That was good. I got a response. Sometimes people just like stare back at me. Hi, I'm Ladislaw, Senior Vice President and Director of the Energy and National Security Program here at CSIS. We're really delighted to see all of you here this morning. Sorry for a little delay. We are waiting for one of our speakers who's stuck in traffic, which, you know, occupational hazard here in Washington, D.C., but we figured we'd get underway. And you guys can catch her up when she arrives on what the discussion has been. We're delighted that you could all be here with us today for the Indo-Pacific Clean Energy Transition Forum. As my colleague Stephen Nawal pointed out on Twitter yesterday, you should follow him, by the way, this is a capstone to a series of work that we've been doing this year, looking at the role of renewable energy in Southeast Asia, and the role that it plays specifically in the changing energy fuel mix, how to deal with issues of climate change and local air pollution, but then also solving the issues of universal energy access, all really important policy priorities, strategically important at a global level, and it was a real joy to be able to spend some time diving into how that is working in Southeast Asia in particular. I recommend to you two reports, and I'm going to do some shameless plugs here for the work that my colleagues have done within the program and with the Southeast Asia program here at CSIS. The first is fuel competition in the expanding power market in Southeast Asia, and the other is the role of renewable energies in achieving universal energy access. Lots of really great information for those of you who are interested in following both of these issues. Today, we're going to look at these trends across the Indo-Pacific region, one of the fastest growing areas for energy demand in the world. And as such, the region plays a particularly important role in the story of renewables deployment. So we find in these workshops that we've been putting on, there's really two core sets of folks that are coming, those who understand the growing strategic importance of the Indo-Pacific region, and those who, and specifically Southeast Asia, to the extent that the report's focused on Southeast Asia explicitly, but then also the folks that are interested in the evolution of renewable energy deployment, the cost decline in those technologies, the new strategies, both partaken by governments, the private sector, international development institutions, to be able to deploy new technologies and new systems as we continue to drive down the cost and perfect those models of development. And so it's been really interesting to follow from both of those perspectives. Today's forum, we're going to focus on grid regionalization and clean energy finance as we anticipate a very energetic and informative discussion on both of those topics. Before we get started, I'd be remiss in not thanking our colleagues in the Southeast Asia program, and Kartikeya Singh, who will be here a little bit later, who we partner with on other projects on energy in India. And Kartikeya works in the India chair, the Wadhwani chair in India studies here at CSIS. We're also deeply grateful to Pertamina for its ongoing support for the Southeast Asia Energy Initiative, which we wouldn't have the time and ability to dedicate quite as much time to this really important region of the world and the energy developments going on there. So this is the second year that we've been doing this work, and look forward to continuing building on that strategic focus and community. So without further ado, I'm going to get off the stage and hand this over to Jane Nakano, who's a senior fellow in the Energy and National Security Program, and will be moderating our first panel, and has been doing a lot of the intellectual leadership on this project. So without further ado, take it away, Jane. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sarah. And welcome again, everyone. And so it's my honor to have this fantastic panel to talk about this, the idea of regional grid integration in Southeast Asia. As Sarah has just mentioned, Southeast Asia is where the energy demand is fast rising. There are a lot of potentials for a lot of different types of energy resources. But in the region, I mean, some of you may remember this idea of regional sort of multilateral grid has been around for some time, at least for 20 years, if not longer. But in recent years, there have been much more sort of, the momentum is rising, in part because the ASEAN minister level, there has been minister level recognition to really want to put more resource into this line of work and make it truly multilateral. But it is kind of, the region is pretty far from Washington, D.C., but there's so much happening that that we may be missing, just sort of trying to read news reports. So I reached out to a couple of the folks that have been actually engaged in the regional work, whether in bilateral manner or from the U.S. National Lab or through some of the stuff that international organizations such as IEA, International Energy Agency, has been trying to put together. So without further ado, let me actually, well, since Dr. Kamel is not here yet, let me jump to the far right. Yanfei Li is an energy economist at AREA, which stands for Economic Research Institute for ASEAN and East Asia. It's an international economic policy think tank that's based in Jakarta, Indonesia. So welcome to Washington. And to his left, from you, to his right, is Jaquelin Cochran. She's the group manager of Market and Policy Analysis Group at the National Renewable Energy Lab, which is based in beautiful Golden, Colorado. Actually, let me just go back a little bit. And so I asked Yanfei to please sort of share with us, since he's from the region, a lot of initiatives that are undergoing there and some of the issues that are starting to rise as some of the immediate opportunities as well as challenges. And then Jaquelin is here to share with us some of the lessons learned from other regional grid integration work, as she's been involved in works in places like India. And then to her left is Craig Glazer. He's the Vice President for Federal Government Policy with PJM. He's here to share with us some of the lessons learned from the North American experience that may be something that Southeast Asian colleagues and stakeholders may take into account as they try to realize the regionalization of the grid system there. And last but not least, Nawal Kamel, she is the director of the ASEAN Energy Market Integration Initiative, and she's based in Bangkok. She will be, and I asked her to please share with us some of the challenges that may be unique to the region, because there have been all these grid regionalization efforts and initiatives in North America or Europe, but what makes it particularly sort of challenging, but then also sort of exciting for that region, and how what are some of the ways that all the stakeholders can move to the next step, if you will. So the idea is each speaker will speak for about 15 minutes, and then after that, I will have some questions that I want to share with the panel, and then so we'll have a little discussion among the speakers, and then open up the floor for Q&A with all of you in the audience. So thank you. So first, Yanfei, please.
Good morning, everyone. So first of all, I would like to thank Jen and her CSIS colleagues for inviting me here. It's really an honor for me to be able to speak here, and actually the topic, I also feel very happy to be able to talk about it here. Clean energy transition for Southeast Asia. It is firstly a regional topic, but increasingly it's becoming a global issue, because to realize this kind of a transition or vision, we not only need the regional efforts, we also need to join the global developments or movements. So what I'm going to talk about, the ASEAN power grid, is one of these, a part of these regional initiatives. And we have come to the stage of actually learning from global experiences as well, in order to build up this kind of institutional capacity to make it happen. For that purpose, actually, I'm already quite familiar with several of the colleagues here, like Craig from PJM. We actually, like 1 month ago, invited, we had the ASEAN Secretariat organizing some workshop and inviting Craig to there to share about the PJM experience, how the the sort of a regional market integration is taking place in the U.S. So we also learn from there. And can you bring on the slide now? Yeah.
Oh, actually, I think
How to do it?
Yeah, let me see it.
Just move. Hold on. Ah, okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Next. Oh, oops. Yeah. Okay. From our research institute's perspective, we have been doing research on this topic for many years. So we started from this quantitative modeling to show what would be the cost and benefits in numbers and show them to the policymakers, to industry stakeholders, and to convince them the second step, the feasibility of the selected cross-border transmission lines. So with this kind of efforts, we understand where it is possible and feasible to build these lines. We recommend to them. They also come up with plans. But what we have seen in the reality is that this is not happening so fast. I mean, the build-up of the infrastructure. There are clearly some barriers in reality. So we also try to understand what they are and how to resolve these barriers. So that's why we have the third step, that is about studying the technical, economic, and institutional barriers and how to remove them. So down there is just some illustration about our basic idea, how we study the cost and benefit, understand the economic value of these cross-border transmission lines. So these are quite classical kind of economics. We've already done that, and we are actually in the third stage, that is studying the barriers and understanding correspondingly what are the institutional capacity that would be needed in that region. So that is the 2016 project. We started to seriously look into this issue. Basically, we covered like regulatory, institutional and technical standards for the ASEAN, and also business model, and then at the top, I think, is always the political drives or the political barriers, how to conquer them. So these are the at the beginning of our study into the institutional issues. So one way of looking at it is perhaps to look back into the history, how it developed, and currently where we are. So ASEAN started a long time ago, 1967. And this APG, ASEAN Power Grid initiative, is actually quite late, like 30 years later. And from then to now, we have seen some progress in the APG, like out of 20 projects, some 10 projects have already been materialized, but still there are many others are on the plan or still ongoing projects. So the new plan, expanded plan, updated one, is reflected in this PIKE. They call it ASEAN sort of action for economic community from 2016 to 2025. It's a grand plan, and power sector integration is a part of this. So basically, a simple word to say is that maybe the progress is slow. So how to accelerate that? We have some initial observations from that year of study. Such as establishment of a network of the operators across the region, so they can talk to each other and identify some problems and solve it together, as is the usual practice in other regional initiatives like European electricity market integration and also US. And things like third-party access, we need to somehow we identify this as a key bottleneck. Somehow we need to resolve it. and followed by like the regulator's role and also how to secure the funding mechanism for this infrastructure. These sort of issues are soft issues, institutional issues. And 2008, we really moved to we really moved to some more details about it. So we identified the institutional issues, and we try to focus for this year on the sort of business model or market design for ASEAN power grid, because without that kind of a vision, actually nobody knows how to where to start with this thing, because clearly a lot of work to be done. So how to step by step get to there, that is our idea. So you need some basic understanding about how a market works, and so how to build it. So we identify this market design for ASEAN by learning from other regions. So PJM is one of the market that we look into. European market, we also try to learn from it. I will skip these details. Actually, we have a YouTube session online to explain all the details about these slides. So if you have time, you can Google about my organization, ERIA, and we have the YouTube session there. And just to mention the key topics under the market design, like nodal pricing, we need to somehow establish there and set up bidding zones, and also think about how to conduct either market coupling or market splitting in order to establish the sort of pricing zones. And we need to think about how to allocate the international transmission capacity. So we need some sort of auctioning process. We also need some common methodology among the countries that agree to estimate the remaining capacities that is available for trading. We also need compensation mechanism, because building them is not for free, using them is also not free. Somebody need to pay for it, for the using of it. So how to do that, coordination among the countries, so that they feel it's fair, and also make it a sustainable business. So our conclusion for that study last year was to set up the institutions coordinate for coordination on the mentioned issues. So we also identify some sort of roadmap to get there, like phase one development of the institutional kind of capacities, and the second phase of building it. And accordingly, we identified who are there to build this, each responsible for certain part of these institutions, like policymakers, regulators, and transmission system operator, and also the system planning people. They need to coordinate among them, among the member countries. So that is why we go further into this. This year's project is still sort of ongoing, yet to be concluded, with some sort of approval from ASEAN governments about the finding of this study. This study is called AGTP, ASEAN Group of the Transmission and the Power Generation Planning, ASEAN Institutions for Planning for short. And this ASEAN institution for transmission system operators. So one group of planners and one group of system operators. These are what we think the fundamental institutions to enable them to be able to talk to each other and embark on some sort of standard making and the harmonization of the practices, and also developing some common methodologies, as I mentioned, to in order to access to the infrastructure and start some sort of a multilateral trading. And for your information, bilateral trading is already happening in ASEAN. there are many cases, and the trading volume is quite big. But what we want to do with all this, as I talk about, is to move into multilateral trading, as what you have in the more developed regional integrated markets. So that's why we try to promote the formation of these two institutions in ASEAN. This is some of the background of the project. We are actually called by HAPWA to conduct this project. HAPWA is the sort of association of the power utility companies in ASEAN countries, and it's directed directly by the ASEAN Secretariat. This is sort of a work plan of the project. We are basically at the end of it, waiting for the approval of the ASEAN governments for the finding, so that we can move to the next steps as suggested by the finding of our study, which is to establish some common agreement among ASEAN countries to set up institution which is for the purpose of serving multilateral trading in ASEAN. This is what we actually envision in the future to be developed as sort of an ASEAN power pool. And under this institution, these functions would be supported, so that supported by these two proposed institutions, so that multilateral trading could actually happen on some sort of a common ground. For information, we have this Laos, Thai, Malaysia agreement, which is a three-country agreement already nailed last year to conduct some sort of test bedding multilateral trading in the region, but it's basically founded on some sort of a long process of a negotiation among the three countries. So it's not easily replicable. What we want to establish is some common ground for multilateral trading. Any company from any country can initiate some sort of deal with other countries. I think basically that's all my slides. Yeah, maybe that's all. So as a quick conclusion, I think we are still on the way. And especially we are trying to figure out what is the suitable market design for ASEAN power grid to function for the multilateral trading of electricity in the region. And we are also, for that purpose, trying to set up the corresponding institutions there. For that, we are still at the stage of studying, like learning from other markets and so on. So we appreciate, so if you from your country or institute, you can provide any sort of assistance or help to this process. I think that's all for now. I appreciate if you have any comments or questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yanfei. Next, let me invite Jaquelin to come up and.
Imagine you're a country trying to integrate your most remote regions, access resources that are geographically dispersed, including in neighboring countries, and improve the reliability of your grid. This was an idea put forward as far back as 1923 in the Chicago Tribune, which I believe is the first depiction of an interconnected continental power system. And the map illustrates what the Tribune describes as how long-distance transmission lines can join industry and nature to improve the American prosperity. Now, while we never actually interconnected our power system, we have 3 separate grids. Studies have continued to evaluate this interconnection and to look at how we can harness resources in remote locations, the coal plants, the oil fields, the hydro, to improve the U.S. economy. These ideas were grounded in classical power engineering and economic principles. Long-distance transmission enables diversity. Diversity lowers the cost of maintaining planning reserves. Optimal use of generating resources lowers costs for ratepayers, and lower costs and shared risk make it easier to maintain reliability. Many of these principles were established by the Federal Power Commission, the predecessor to FERC, in its 1967 report on the Northeast blackout. And what the report goes into more detail is the engineering and economic benefits of integrating and interconnecting multiple power systems. The report also underscores the importance of regional coordination. Strong regional organizations should be established for the coordination of planning, construction, operation, and maintenance of individual bulk power systems. Planning, construction, operations, maintenance. Note the breadth of responsibilities of this kind of coordinating body, an idea that I'll come back to later, towards the end of my talk. So if the value looked, I'm going to move this so I can see the screen.
Sure. Yes.
If the value looked that good back then, what about today? Today we have more solar and wind generation on our grids. And solar and wind resources are spatially diverse. This is a map of Kazakhstan and where the wind resources are. The impact of weather is greater. So we've always been concerned about weather. System operators needed to know weather to anticipate the next day's demand, to understand how rainfall or lack thereof affects hydro availability, and also how ambient temperatures affect thermal plant operations. But now we have more weather-dependent generation on the system, wind and solar. We also have more weather-dependent demand on the system, for example, the air conditioning systems that are growing worldwide. So the impact of weather is more complex today. We also have diurnal patterns that we've always had related to demand, but now also related to the supply of electricity, most obviously solar generation. And our fluctuations are seasonal too. We are now responsible for managing the seasonal variations in demand with a supply that can also be more seasonal, such as hydro and wind. And we have new technologies on the system. I mentioned solar and wind, which with the right inverter technologies can provide essential grid reliability services. We've also had vast improvements to the technologies related to transmission, especially since 1923. And we can provide higher voltage transmission lines with low losses. Evidence demonstrates the benefits of more interconnected grids for both cost savings and renewable energy integration. So let me start with the latter. This is a chart that shows the output of wind turbines over about an 8-hour period in Minnesota. And the lower chart shows the output of the total of 15 wind turbines, and the upper chart shows 200 turbines. And you can see that as each wind turbine has its unique wind patterns at that moment. So when you aggregate more wind turbines, and especially as you aggregate it over broader geographic areas, you get a smoothing effect, which reduces the variability of these types of resources. You can also use interconnection to improve the flexibility of your power system at lower cost. So let's start with the chart on the upper left. Let's imagine you're balancing area A. You're responsible for maintaining the balance of supply and demand in your region A. And demand goes up 600 megawatts, so your supply has to go up 600 megawatts. At the same time, your neighbor is reducing its supply to match its falling demand by 400 megawatts. If you were to operate these individually, you're ramping up and down in opposite directions, but if you interconnect these two areas, you can look at the whole area and you can save 400 megawatts of ramping. You're only going up 200 megawatts. This also has cost advantages. So let's imagine that these two areas, A and B, can each ramp 1,000 megawatts an hour. Combined, if they were to do these separately, this is a supply cost curve of the power plants that can provide this kind of ramping. If they were to each ramp separately the 1,000 megawatts an hour, they would have to do so at least $40 per megawatt hour. But if you look at the resources and take the cheapest plants from each, you can reach that 1,000 megawatts of ramping much lower on the cost curve, less than half the price. So they're cost savings. We've also seen the benefits of making use of interconnected grids in our India study, a renewable energy grid integration study. We dove into the year 2022 and looked at India when it's anticipating to have 175 gigawatts of renewable energy, primarily wind and solar generation. What the chart on the left shows is the outputs of our modeling, where we looked at how the grid is balanced every 15 minutes of the year. And each color represents a different fuel type. So dark blue is wind, light blue is hydro, yellow is solar, black and gray are coal. And now the sun's coming up, you're going to see daylight come, the solar generation comes online, and we're also beginning to see a little bit of red. This red is renewable energy curtailment, and this is renewable energy that's available to be used, but the grid couldn't absorb it, it couldn't take it. And what we found in this study is that current operating practices in India are very state-centric in terms of responsibility for supply and demand. So each state looks ahead to its next day's generation and is responsible for using its generation sources that it owns or as under contract or allocation to meet that demand. But there are savings to be had if you broaden that perspective from the states to region or even the full country. So let me give you an example. Here we go. So this is the state of Andhra Pradesh right here. Andhra Pradesh has lower cost of coal generation compared to its neighboring southern states. So if you were to optimize the generation mix over the entire southern region, you would use more of Andhra Pradesh's generation and less of the generation, the coal sources in its neighboring states. So more AP coal, fewer sources in the other states. If you were to do this and replicate this activity in each of India's 5 regions, India could save close to $1 billion annually in operating costs. So that's the same infrastructure, but operated more efficiently. And there are even improved savings if you look at that from a national optimization perspective. And I wanted to note that this interactive website is available through that URL on the bottom. You can play around with it. We also are seeing the value of interconnection in our work that we're looking at between India and Sri Lanka. This is part of the program with the State Department's South and Central Asia Bureau's Regional Connectivity Program, where we're looking at the impact of cross-border electricity trade. So we're staying in the year 2022. We've got the India's renewable energy, a lot of which is focused. There's a strong solar and wind resource in the southern part of the region, next to Sri Lanka. And there's so a lot of solar wind will be coming on there. Sri Lanka is also looking to increase its renewable energy. Its plans call for an increase from 3% of generation today of renewable energy to 21% by 2025. So if we look at these two grids in this future year where there's renewable energy on both, we see the value of adding a 500 megawatt HVDC line, underseas direct current cable, for cost savings and other benefits. So for example, just like the example I gave with Andhra Pradesh, Sri Lanka is able to turn down its more expensive generation and import from India 77% of the year. India also benefits from importing from Sri Lanka 14% of the year when the hydro is really strong in Sri Lanka. India also is able to reduce its renewable energy curtailment. That red that I was showing you on the next slide, now they've got a bigger market to serve, and so there's not as much excess electricity. But the physical grid and the physical systems are not sufficient. We also want to make sure the market and the institutions enable the optimal use of this physical infrastructure. So in our previous talk was a great example. That talk was a real focus on how do we align up the institutions to get this right. So you can imagine from the Sri Lanka example, that Sri Lanka grid operator we can see in our modeling that there's benefits of importing 77% of the time and exporting 14%, but how do we operationalize that? How do we make sure that the system operators are aware of, where generation is available and at what price? How do we line up the schedules and all the market rules? Many different details that the previous talk showed quickly through. So this market and institutional filter is the hard part of the equation, and to get this right. Another example of the importance of this institutional filter, we are looking as part of the same regional connectivity program with the State Department, we are looking at cross-border trade between Nepal and Northeast India and the neighbors. And here too, we are seeing the importance of getting the market and economic context right. So our draft findings suggest Nepal is anticipating developing its hydro resources, and also there are plans underway to improve the cross-border transmission lines between Nepal and India. So our draft findings suggest that while Nepal might have the physical capacity to increase its annual exports to India significantly, much of this additional hydro generation will go unused if the current market inefficiencies remain. But this can change if you change the institutions. So, for example, if transactions between India and Nepal are treated the same as transactions between states and India, the same market friction internationally as domestically, then all of this new hydro generation could be competitive to import into India and in turn into Bangladesh. This institutional context affects many aspects of the system. And so I was suggesting earlier about the Federal Power Commission's report on the importance of regional planning. We have planning, procurement, operations, markets, retail side. So much of this gets affected when we're thinking about interconnections. So on the planning side, there's the challenge of how do you look across multiple interconnections to see what the right mix of generation and transmission is? How do we site new infrastructure? How do we allocate costs? These are especially thorny questions. How do we evaluate the competitiveness of current, existing, and new generation as we're interconnecting? How do we allocate project development risks? We also have operational concerns. For example, if we might need to synchronize two separate grids, align grid codes, change protocols for energy balancing. Our previous talk talked a lot about the markets and the market rules, and then even on the retail side about who absorbs costs of stranded assets, which might inevitably come up as you interconnect and gain efficiencies. So in summary, interconnection is not a new idea. All the same value of interconnection that we've always had still holds today. But the transmission and the interconnections have become more important with the growth of renewable energy and weather-dependent demand and supply. And the value of this grid infrastructure to improve trade and enhance economic and reliable operation depends on the institutional context. Thank you.
Sounds good. Let me just turn this off.
All right. Monty Python used to say, now for something completely different. So I'm going to do something completely different, but actually maybe not that different. And that is I'm going to start with telling a story. And I remember going back to, whenever you say that, we all go back to elementary school where the teacher tells us it's story time, and everybody looks up and figures they're going to be entertained. Not sure I'm going to entertain you today, but I am going to tell you a story of evolution, an evolution of markets that I think has some lessons for the ASEAN region as it embarks upon this, And perhaps most importantly, it's an unfinished story, unlike the one you had in elementary school where there was a nice ending to it. This is, in fact, an unfinished story, one that we are still working to finish today. But enough of that introduction. Let me bring you, first off, greetings from PJM Interconnection. I can tell you that headquartered in Philadelphia, we are a long way from the ASEAN region. But what I always love about the subject of electricity is that kilowatt hours are a common currency. It's a common language. It's a common technology and physics that we all respect and utilize, and yet it's so, so important to our economic development, our social well-being, environmental policy, et cetera. So there is always a bond among countries when you talk about kilowatt hours, because they really are the same in that sense. Just a word, I'm going to skip a little bit. This is actually a presentation I did in Jakarta, but I'll come back to pieces of it. Just a word about PJM. We are the largest, from population point of view, the largest regional grid operator in North America. We have 165,000 megawatts of load, 178,000 megawatts of generation, and serve roughly 61 million Americans in a region that stretches literally from Chicago down to North Carolina up to the New York border. And we recently were retained by the International Energy Agency to present a case study, a story, if you will, of evolution of cross-border trading in our market that IEA and ASEAN and others can then use to pull out some lessons that might be relevant for the ASEAN region. And the PJM model is often held up as sort of this worldwide model. It gets lots of visitors as a really working model, melding reliability and public policy and competition and efficiency. But the truth of the matter is we didn't get there. We're still evolving toward that goal, and we didn't get here overnight. There is a lot of history associated with this and lessons learned, and that's what I really wanted to. I spent time in Jakarta imparting and want to just impart a little bit to you today. First of all, I'm a sort of a student of history, so I love to look forward by looking back. And in the case of PJM, I'll just spend a few minutes on the United States development and then get to lessons learned perhaps for the ASEAN region. But we are really a story of two different models, two very different regions that have come together, and if you think of states as nations, in fact, some of the evolution, some of the issues we have are very much the same as those that the ASEAN region might face. So what am I talking about? In the western part of PJM, including my own home state of Ohio, we had a series of vertically integrated utilities. Each utility was an island. It planned and dispatched its own system. There was some trading when there was a split the savings, opportunity-based trading, but investments were made by each utility, justifying it to its regulator. Okay, and each utility had the obligation to build and procure, again, with sort of limited cross-border trading. That system worked from the beginning of time, and I'll come back to this, but in the eastern parts, where it's a tale of two different cities, if you will, in the eastern part of PJM, we had a power pool from the get-go, a power pool for sharing of capacity and single dispatch. And people often say, well, PJM's different, they had started with a power pool, and that's true in half the region, but not true in the other half, yet both have come together to get those market efficiencies that our last speaker spoke of. Let's go to the western region. As I said, it was each utility built its own. Each regulator looked at prudence reviews of the prudence of those investments. What off-system sales were done were really more for economics. There was a limited role for the federal regulator. And there were advantages to this model. It wasn't all a negative model by any means. One important benefit of this model, and this is sort of a challenge for the ASEAN region, is it maintained individual state sovereignty. And if there's one word I heard in Jakarta over and over again, it was maintain national sovereignty. Okay, these are issues we're still fighting about in the United States, and yet are ones that we need to figure out to tackle in the ASEAN region as well. And localized planning and expansion, every utility doing its own thing, every state like a country doing its own thing, 100% met your individual country policies. Maybe not the most efficiently, but you met them. The minister told you what to do, and you did it. Okay? That were some of the advantages, but as the last speaker did a great job pointing out, there were lots of disadvantages. It was costly. It was inefficient. It halted development of this robust grid that could allow some of these efficiencies. It didn't do much for the environment, quite frankly, because everybody was sort of overbuilding fossil generation, but even other forms of generation. And it put on the backs of the customers the full cost of building out the infrastructure. So each state, each nation built out its own infrastructure, and those costs were borne, which made it very, very expensive. In the east part of PJM, the states of Maryland, Pennsylvania, Delaware, we had a completely different model. This project, the hydro project up on the Susquehanna River, just up on I-95 here, was developed in 1927. It had more capacity than was needed to serve individual utilities. So the three utilities got together and said, let's share that capacity, let's centrally dispatch that capacity, and let's build out a transmission system so we all can benefit. It sounds so simple. In 1927, this was unheard of as a thing. And from that, the power pool was born. So various transmission and purchase power cost arrangements, and the role of the state regulator was somewhat limited. So sovereignty was somewhat limited under this, but they still had a role in deciding what the mix was in their particular state. There's advantages to the power pool. There was a lot of sharing of costs and efficiencies. The single dispatch, this was a single dispatch of the plants in the region, maximized use of each pool member's generation, transmission planning, maximized transfer capabilities, and it smoothed out a continual problem in this industry of what we call lumpy investment. Very expensive investment that somebody has to put up the money for. It also took advantage of diversity of peaks, weather conditions, and customer profiles, as was mentioned before, and allowed each utility to meet its customers' needs at least cost. But nothing is absolute in this business. It too had disadvantages. In its original form, it was closed to new investment. I actually sued PJM in a former life because it was closed to investment. I never mentioned that in my job interview that I sued them and won, actually, because it was closed to investment. It required a lot of trust among the regulators and among the participants. Required agreements on no builds. It required everybody to meet their requirements and have a process if somebody was leaning on the rest of the system because they didn't put up their end of the bargain, if you will. They didn't build out what they needed to build out. And the degree of savings that individual countries, or in this case states, realized was very different, depending on each utility's, each policy's state's resource choices. So what does that lead to? When you have a single dispatch, you've got cost shifting. You've got some regions benefiting more, some benefiting less. The dispatch sometimes works in favor of a state's policy, sometimes doesn't work in favor of that state's policy. They're always not easily accomplished through that. But as was mentioned before, the cost savings are tremendous from that. I'm going to stop the history lesson, although I love this slide, frankly, because we moved to competition, retail choice, that moved us in a different place in the U.S. But I want to fast forward, and bear with me, I got to fast forward a bunch of slides here. We really took the folks in the region through all of this. But I want to go to What are the lessons that we learned from this evolution to where we are today with a very robust market? A couple of lessons that I think are notable is one, market establishment ain't easy. It ain't easy. It's a complex challenge with high stakes. That might sound obvious, but this is, you think about it, you are bringing together policy differences, governmental differences, and we had this as we evolved PJM, different levels of infrastructure and therefore different regions leaning on the system in different ways, the need to develop some market principles, and peppered over this a drive for individual national sovereignty. So it's not easy. This is a high-stakes game with a lot of complexity that has to be sorted out. And we started in 1927, and as I mentioned at the beginning, we're still doing that. Two is the scope of this is a moving target. I like to call electricity sort of, as we're changing out, it's kind of like the airplane that you have to change in mid-flight. You have to redesign it in mid-flight because it really is a plane that can never land. We can't say we're going to take down the grid today to redesign it. We can't do that. We need it, so we're literally changing out parts, changing the system while the plane is still flying. That is in and itself a unavoidable reality, but one that we really have to carefully manage. And what's also important is we often think about the technicalities of market design and infrastructure, but there's a whole lot more to that. Significant organizational changes and national changes and process development. I'll just tell you a little story in the ASEAN region. I was very impressed because there is the beginnings of some three-way trading between Laos, Thailand, and Malaysia, where Thailand is operating as a sort of a through country, if you will, managing a trade really between Laos and Malaysia. But we started asking questions about, well, what happens if Thailand declares an emergency and says it needs the power? What's the understanding as to Malaysia's rights to that power? What's the grid code that establishes what's an emergency? What are the rights of the parties? That's all sort of, as I experience, really things to work out. So there's sort of casual trading going on, which is great. But to bring this to something that people are going to rely on, that the people of Malaysia, for example, are going to rely on a distant resource in Laos, there needs to be an understanding as to, okay, what are the limitations? What are my rights to that power? What are the conditions when that power can be curtailed, et cetera? And that's really work that needs to happen outside of just pure market design. A couple of other issues. One is whatever is done, and we've learned this probably sometimes the hard way, make sure you have a soft landing. Transitions are really, really important. California tried to do a flash cut, didn't work so well in the US. We implemented markets one at a time with a lot of transmission. There's a lot of existing rights, there's a lot of existing expectations. Providing a soft landing is critical. And finally, although designing the systems to work is incredibly important to this, one of the frequent causes of delay is that we didn't bring everybody along at the same time. We were so busy building the system that we didn't follow what I call the 3 T's, training of all the people from the policymakers to the market participants to the large customers, how this is going to change how they acquire this product. Testing, certainty, that's an obvious one, but testing and retesting and finally tracking. Don't just put this on autopilot. You have to continuously change the gears as the plane is flying. So the third lesson I implored was the 3 T's, training, testing, and tracking. With that, I'll close and I'd be happy to answer questions. Thank you very much. Thank you.
So last but not least, Nawal, you can just stay seated.
I lost my name. I'm nameless now.
Knocked out.
Yeah, take another one. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Craig will be very surprised because I'm going to share with him the story but I'll take you behind the scenes. I'll take you all with me to Southeast Asia, because the story I want to tell you is the story behind his story, and it's the story of what's going on in Southeast Asia in terms of bringing together their energy powers, and more specifically in their ASEAN power grid. What happens? What made them actually think of building this grid, and where are they today, where they should be, what has been their successes, what have been their failures, and the greatest news is that they are moving now forward with a very new idea, and I think that your services will be very valued over there. So I want to take you through a story in 5 parts, and the story, again, I'm repeating, is counted to you from the perspective of the 10 ASEAN countries in Southeast Asia, where I have been located for the last 5 years, working for Chulalongkorn University, and also leading a network of ASEAN economists working to support the ministers of energy over there in their decision about market integration in ASEAN. So I will start by going into history a bit to tell you about where did that all start. First, I want to say that the word ASEAN might be a bit foreign to you. It is an acronym for the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, and it was established back in 1967. It started by the mainland Southeast Asian countries, the 5 of them, and ended up growing into the 10 member states and creating the region as we know it today. Right from the beginning, ASEAN had the perspective of enhancing the energy connectivity and in creating a regional and integrated market. And right from the beginning, the leaders, the 10 leaders of ASEAN, recognized that they need such a market power integration in order to increase their energy security. And maybe with all the events happening now, which I'm sure you follow in the region about energy, this has become a growing concern and a very wise move that they get together as a region to achieve energy security. They also had in their vision increased accessibility to clean power and to electricity. And if I had time, I would show you how varied this target has been reached now in Southeast Asia, with some countries like 99% access to electricity, and others like Myanmar, where we still have at least 70% of the people not having access to electricity today. The leaders, when they developed this vision, also were talking about affordability of electricity and sustainability of the electric power system in all the member states. This was very much also a building block of the ASEAN Economic Community, the AEC. The AEC was created in 2015, so it's quite recent. And it actually was created to create in Southeast Asia a single market of production base. And they have committed to each other free flow of goods, free flow of services, investment, and also, very importantly, free flow of labor with the provision that it's only skilled labor that are free to flow. So why is energy so important to them? Well, very simple reason. There is what we call the looming energy gap. All analysts know about that. What is it? It is simply that the region is growing extremely dynamically. It's growing like this. And the energy demands, of course, to sustain such a growth are also growing like this. While the sources of energy are limited, and a lot of this growth, it depends on imports of fossil fuels from outside. So we all can know and see that actually, according to the IEA report in 2015, actually in that report there's an annex and a section about ASEAN energy. And I've taken out some of the numbers from this report, just to give you an idea. The report says that in the time between 2015 and 2040, actually the energy needs of Southeast Asia will triple. It's a lot. Now, the morality of these numbers that you see there, and I'm sorry I don't have a colored graph and everything, which they have in the report. But the morality is the following, and this is what I want to point out. How the hell are they going to meet their increased demand? Look at coal. Coal use will grow from about 30 to 50%. It's a big growth. And it's no good news for the environment. When I show these numbers to some of the diplomats in the region, they all were out and scared by the prospect that the region will be increasingly using coal. And of course, there's some clean coal technology and what's not, but there is a debate about whether coal can be clean enough for us to be secure about our environmental future. This is what I want to say. Also, renewables. Renewables will increase from 17 to 22 under the best scenario. And if you could see, hydro is not meant to grow a lot. The growth is very, very small. And under the other that go from 0 to 4, there's hopes for introducing wind and solar energy. But a lot needs to be done about that. So this is the looming energy gap, and this is why the leaders within ASEAN made it a priority to try to address this issue. Rightly so, of course. Now, beyond the looming energy gap, of course, there has been lots of studies, and just seeing the experience around the world, it is actually a consensus now within ASEAN that connecting the countries by their electric grid or energy market integration in general will deliver potential benefits for the region and for each and every one of them. For a region that has 650 million people, that is kind of sandwiched between China and India, this is a very valuable proposition. So I'm not going to spend too much time on that because it is accepted wisdom that as a region, you are going to get more powerful and deliver to your people more benefit if you could get your energy system hooked together. But let me just go through them very quickly to remind you, and also to remind you that this is how they are thinking. They are realizing that, they know that. We, our group, had made many presentations to the ministers, and this is now accepted wisdom, that Getting together into energy market integration will make them realize a more efficient use of their own national resources, and that, of course, there will be economic benefits in terms of decreasing the costs, and utilities will be able to balance the excess supply and demand in a more active way and reduce the cost for developing infrastructure, new infrastructure, which is a major issue. Also, it will help optimize the regional investment, and that has been very important. I will talk to you in a minute about the ASEAN power grid. A lot of investment went into there right from the beginning of their coming together. So reducing the costs and delivering better investment environment where financial returns are more predictable is very important for decision makers in terms of their investment decisions. Finally, it is hoped that this coming together of the energy sectors among the 10 countries will actually help improve access to electricity. And I wish I had a map because the geography speaks for itself. So if you have Myanmar here, and 80 or 70 to 80% of the people don't access electricity, there are two choices. Either the national grid should be built all the way from north to south, or they can simply connect to the regional grid in a much more efficient way. So obviously, the coming together of these 10 countries would make it easier for accessing electricity in the remote areas or the countries that have been left behind. And finally, and most importantly, they see it, and that is maybe the bottom line, and that's where it all started, energy security. And this is a very loaded word, which we could have another panel discussion on. But for them, it's very clear, if you can decrease your dependence on imports, and if you could build up a spirit that you stand together on energy issues, that you support each other, supply and demand in this power sector, then you are building a stronger region. And this is more importantly so because they want to build an economic community. How can they do it if they don't have a cohesion in the way they access their own energy needs? Finally, and standalone, the environment. This was not part of their initial thinking, but their thinking now has grown into looking at ways to introduce and to use better the renewable resources in the 10 countries more efficiently together, to tap into these resources together and have a greater penetration of renewable energy, and also coming together to address the technical challenges. As you know, managing intermittency of renewable generation sources is a challenge. It is a challenge for them. It's a challenge they're still grappling with. But it has been now increasingly clear to them that if, for example, the hydropower up there in the northern part and underdeveloped part of Southeast Asia, in Myanmar, Laos, PDR, and also Vietnam, and to some extent Cambodia, not much, but this hydropower is actually producing excess energy for these countries because their energy needs are not as strong as other countries in southeastern part, for example, Singapore or even Malaysia, or even Thailand right there, where the energy need, because the industrialization level is much more advanced, is much greater. So how can you actually channel the hydropower, the clean hydropower, all the way from Laos, let's say, all the way down to Singapore? And that will bring me to some of what Craig was saying in a minute. 2 minutes? 2 minutes left. Oh, okay. So in my 2 minutes, I will go quickly to tell you that realizing all of this, back in 1997, ASEAN heads of states decided that they were going to build a grid, very extensive grid. And there was a picture in his slide that he didn't show you. But the grid goes through the 10 ASEAN countries, and it's very extensively developed, and lots of energy and investment went into it. And the objective was their vision of actually achieving reaping all the benefits I was just talking to you about by using that grid on a multinational basis. Multinational, that means that I can take Laos hydropower and bring it all the way down to Singapore. What happened is that the grid was built, the grid was functioning, but it functioned on a bilateral basis only. So between Thailand and Laos, or between Malaysia and Singapore, but it did not so far yet realize the multinational vision that is so important if all the benefits I spoke about were to be realized. I can answer why this is so, but in the limited time I have, I shall not attempt to do that now. But this remains a challenge for them, how to make it work on a multilateral basis. They tried LTMS. So Greg talked about Laos, going through Thailand, giving energy to Malaysia. Initially, it was going all the way to Singapore. And I can tell you another story about why the S was dropped. But now it's LTM, and they take this as a pathfinder of, okay, let us try it, let us force it, let us do it, and see why we cannot. Finally, and I'm going to end on that, this LTMS experience was loaded with lessons, positives and negatives. And part of the negative was why the S dropped, which we couldn't talk about. But our group challenged the ministers and told them, wait a minute, you're not the only region who's trying to connect. There are other regions as well in Latin America, in the Nordic countries. There are regions within the US, as we just heard, but also in the Southern African countries and Central America. So what do? Well, believe it or not, they have a marketplace where supply meets demand, prices are set, wheeling fees are set, and the marketplace becomes the buyer of all buyers and the seller of all sellers. And you don't need to go through these lengthy one-on-one bilateral discussions and MOUs and what's not. You do not need to do that. You just create that market basis. And this is the challenge that they're tackling right now. And we all wish them good luck. And I hope that we'll be able to support them in their endeavor to create this multilateral electricity trading platform and to make it work for the benefit of the region, but for our benefit all. Because remember, we won't call out renewable energy in. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. I mean, that was a fantastic set of 4 presentations. It's, I think we have about 10 to 15 minutes left, so let me, I have so many questions that I can ask, but I think that the benefit of regional grid is quite obvious, and particularly, after seeing some cool graphics that Jaquelin shared with us. I mean, there's a great way to address the renewable curtailment, which is one of the recurring sort of issues that we've been looking at under this CSIS and Pertamina series. My colleagues and I looked at all these different access issues, or whether it's the fuel competition. Always curtailment is one of the issues, and certainly having all these different countries with different types of resources and different levels, it allows you to be able to address that sort of challenge. But then, as also Craig mentioned, there's the national sovereignty issue, right? So, because there are all these different countries, they have, as he also, and many of you said on the panel, it's not just that there are already existing policies or infrastructure, but it's also different levels of interest. What they want out of this may be quite different, given the level of your economic development, but then also the given of even your domestic political economic structure, not infrastructure, structure. But I guess the way that I see it, like how there's greater momentum now, and with all these ASEAN ministers really, being a lot more open to input from outside experts, do I take it that, we are seeing more trust? I mean, that was another keyword. Like, is there finally the type of trust that's needed to have things like the power pool, going, forward. But then also, if please, I mean, given the limited time, but if you can share with us, what are some of the key ingredients and, key participants that you think could be a good role model for others in ASEAN? Obviously, we don't want to, name and shame. So, some of the, the role models that you see, having the right domestic environment and type of, I guess, the trust building attitude towards this type of engagement.
Try. This is, of course, a very important question, and you said the word trust. So I was going to say national sovereignty, which was mentioned, has at least two dimensions. First is the matter of trust. The matter of trust is very important because if you start building a structure where you depend on your neighbor to get your energy needs, you might be into trouble if the neighbor closes the gate. So this is very important. And it is to some extent always present. But don't forget that the 10 Asian countries, Southeast Asian countries, have together an economic community. So they have to make it work. The ASEAN economic community is a reality. The single platform for production is already a reality, and they have to make it work. So the issue of trust goes beyond the energy. If they don't trust each other on energy, how can they trust each other on the economic community? And how can they trust each other if they know they're sandwiched, and again, I repeat, between India and China? It is a matter of survival for them to be able to trust each other. That's the first point. The second point about national sovereignty is very simply the structure of the electricity market, and it is different. There are some of the markets that are completely free, market-based, and some that are completely designed by the government with prices set in a completely unmarket way. They also have different legal systems. They also have different codes. They have everything different. So this is really a big challenge. And this is why when we started to design this multilateral electricity trading platform, we told them, each of you continue your national markets as you wish. This platform come only for your marginal needs. If you have a gap, you come to the market. If you have a surplus, you come to the market. We're not going to agree on national electricity systems where we have such a varied approach to governing in different countries. If you think of Singapore again, or even Malaysia versus, for example, Laos, where things are very different, or Vietnam. So let the national electricity utilities do their work nationally. If they have a gap, they have a choice. They either generate it nationally or they go to the market. And if Laos has a surplus, because they have more hydropower than they can use, instead of having bilateral talks and deciding how to reach Singapore, they just go to the marketplace. So this is the type of approach that we've advocated, and I think is the only approach that could work.
Anyone wants to jump in?
I totally agree with that. In the U.S., these markets have largely developed originally as voluntary imbalance markets, we call them, where you may be short a given hour and you can generate power or you can go to the market, so it's strictly voluntary. We see that in the West. We see that in other parts, so I think that is appropriate. The rub is, for any of that to work, you still need a level of infrastructure and somebody to pay for the infrastructure that you don't necessarily have in the region right now, the degree of interconnection. So it's a bit of a chicken and egg problem of how do you fund the wires, basically, and the infrastructure to even make that happen. So you need a little more buy-in in that sense for someone to fund that infrastructure. And that was an issue I know we talked about in Jakarta as sort of the next step.
You must be a mind reader, because that was the other question. We have a second panel with fantastic experts that will talk about financing needs for clean energy transition. So I don't want to get too much into the issue of financing, but in many ways, I think this is something that the Southeast Asian stakeholders want to see, to take it to the success level with their own, sort of efforts, and in a way to have the type of independence, perhaps, that they want. The financing could be, the type of financing needs that they may be able to have external help to fulfill could be both blessing and curse, if you will. What type of discussion is happening in the region to meet, to help meet the financing needs to build up this infrastructure while maintaining the regional sovereignty, not the national sovereignty, but ASEAN sovereignty, if you will? Any taker? Maybe Yanfei?
Sorry, my mind is still a little bit trapped in that previous one, and those comments were very inspiring, and I was thinking that maybe this sovereignty issue and trust issue has more layers than we think, because some of them may be rooted in the sort of technical issues like system reliability and energy security concerns. It is so. There's this recent example that Bangkok went through a blackout, I think a few months earlier. And as you know, Thailand system is very intensively interconnected with the Laos system. So it turns out that was caused by a trip from Laos side. Some sort of hydro dam went offline, and it was a big one, so that the system on the Thailand side was not able to respond in time with sufficient capacity, so that the whole system went offline. because of that trip. So this is caused a lot of concern about the energy security. And at the same time, it's actually a word that we have talked about earlier, that is the system reliability. So on the one hand, I think to make it go, we probably, from the beginning, need a sort of a minimum data sharing and a minimum level of technical harmonization to make it go. But as the volume of trading go higher, that is certainly not enough, as now the Thailand case show us that we need actually higher level of integration, harmonization. So this reminds us that you sort of need to balance between sovereignty issue, trust issue, and the technical harmonization that is needed. If you go too low of a harmonization, of course, sovereignty and trust is not an issue, but then the security and the system reliability become a problem. So if you go too high, then some people may raise the issue of sovereignty and trust. So my current conclusion is that we probably need an appropriate strategy to make it work to start with, and then go further, so as to solve this kind of a chicken and egg problem. If the political will and the sovereignty or trust the issue is too much a concern, I think investors will also hesitate to go with the investment. So that's my observation. Thank you.
Let me now open the floor to questions from the audience. Yes, sir. And just a housekeeping sort of request. If you could please wait for the microphone and tell us who you are, who you're with, and then ask the question in the form of a question. Thanks.
My name is Trey Taylor, Verdant Power. We're an ocean energy company building technologies that harvest the kinetic energy from all water, ocean currents, tides, rivers. We've been on the Irrawaddy River. We've been working with the ministry, of Myanmar. My question is this, and I did not hear this addressed from any of you. We talk about transmission, but the world is moving away from centralized to decentralized power. So might there be, and another thing to add to what I'm about to say is I've, for the last 8 years, been serving on an advisory committee of renewable energy efficiency at the Department of Commerce. And the common refrain amongst all of us in renewable energy is the idea of exporting virtual power plants. It's the idea of studying regional integrated resource assessment. What are the clean indigenous resources of any community, to microgrid that community so it is sustainable, if not island itself, using utility speak, that is self-sustained. And then connecting microgrids to microgrids. That becomes a new role for transmission, at the same time provides a pathway for clean energy transition. So that's my question, is that being considered in all that's going on right now in that part of the world?
I can speak to some parts. Like India, there's a lot of consideration about this virtual power plant idea of how you can aggregate different sources of demand to respond to market signals, but it's pretty early on still, since they don't have a robust market yet to participate in.
I would just say I don't think it's an either-or proposition. I think you need a interconnected grid. In some ways, you could argue the region today is a series of microgrids. Each country is a microgrid, in effect. So I think, I think it's not an either-or choice here. I think there's, especially given the urbanization, I think a lot of interconnection would be helpful, and that provides, frankly, the pathway for the microgrids to monetize their product as well. So I don't think it's, one versus the other.
So let me then take two questions together, and then if you can wait till you hear the second question, and then yeah.
I'm Reed Detchen with the United Nations Foundation. Craig, in your history, you described these two different systems, and then magically they were joined up. What was the political trigger that overcame the state sovereignty issues that they're dealing with here and at a national level?
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm Charles Feinstein, formerly with the World Bank, now retired. WAP, SAP, YAP, West Africa Power Pool, South Africa Power Pool, East Africa Power Pool. Relatively robust, dynamic, growing power pools in Africa. A region, at least compared to Southeast Asia, not particularly well governed, subject to lots of intra-regional, interregional conflict, relatively lower technical managerial sophistication. What accounts for that region's success in setting up power pools, admittedly mostly operating on a bilateral, not a multilateral basis yet, as compared to Southeast Asia? And I guess I have one possible response, and that is, you look at Africa, most states are in pure energy deficit, whereas Southeast Asia, at least until recently, they've been characterized by energy surplus or relative autarky. Could that account for the different evolution in power pooling in these two regions? Thank you.
I'll go back. The first one is for me, and I skipped over that. That's where the power plant, the cooling tower was being demolished. In its broadest sense, it was a degree of frustration, regulatory and customer frustration with the inefficiencies of the existing system. A lot of that, and we're talking about now in the 1980s, a lot of that had to do with cost overruns at nuclear power plants and a lot of history. So it really was almost like a grassroots drive for change, led largely by industrial customers, but it sort of caught on. So utilities in that space and state commissions in that space said, maybe there's a better way. And the fundamental driver, I think, was shifting the risk, the allocation of risk from 100% on the backs of the customers to let's go to a market-based system where some of that risk is absorbed in a competitive model. That was sort of the philosophy. Then states like Ohio and Indiana and Illinois looked around and said, how do we effectuate that? And here was this little market in PJM that had been sort of doing this for some years, and he said, let's join that and let's transform that. In a nutshell, that's sort of what happened. So the good news is it was a grassroots effort. It's now sort of going in the other direction, which is another whole story, but we can talk about that later.
Yanfei, do you want to take the second question?
Maybe a little bit comment from me regarding the second question. I'm not very familiar with the African case, although in our past studies we sort of touched on, but not very deep knowledge about it, how it come into being. And I understand that, like, the South African power pool is moving into a very advanced stage of trading. It's moving into a sort of a day-ahead market, and now probably also looking at the hourly trading market. So quite advanced stage. And I think ASEAN is still far away from that. First thing is that I think we're sort of short of a third-party access agreement from the beginning to start with. So without that, actually it's not possible to have any sort of a power pool or multilateral trading. So this kind of legal barrier is the first thing we need to conquer. And I'm not so sure how this issue was solved in Africa in detail. I know that they come into some sort of intergovernmental agreement so that the third-party access was not a problem from the beginning, but we are yet to get there. So that is our situation. And after that, maybe we can also learn from the African experience that we can play with this do whatever you can until there's some warning sign or alert is sounding. That was, I learned how the African system started. So basically everybody put the surplus resources on the table and start the trading until some system says we cannot go with this and we need to fall back to some sort of default plan. I'm not sure that is going to really work in ASEAN because in ASEAN region, I think the regulators and policy makers are very strong, and that they may not give such kind of a tolerance to the kind of a risk, involved. So we're not sure yet how we get down there. But to begin with, I think we certainly need an agreement, intergovernmental agreement. That is our key lesson learned from the African model. Thank you.
Yeah, just to add to what the other panelists said, of course the African power pool has a very big characteristic, and this is led by South Africa. So out of the 12 countries, there is a very big, heavy contributor there. Actually, most of the trading is around South Africa. So this is a model. If we take the other model, the Nordic countries, for example, the 5 Nordic countries, which is a power pool that's so successful that is now expanding to the Baltic and also, as you know, trading with Europe, starting to trade with Europe. So that's very successful. And between the 5 countries of the Nordic countries, there's a better dynamic of supply and demand and equilibrium. So it's not led by one country only. So it's another model. And of course, as my colleague said, there are lots of barriers that have to be addressed when we come to ASEAN. Legal system, regulatory codes, harmonization of many things that has to take place. But as an economist, I can tell you, it starts with the supply and demand. Is there a need for a country to buy from another? Is there supply and demand dynamics? Yes, they exist. And I wish I could show the map, but there are countries with surpluses and there are countries with gaps. So that's essentially the basis. Now we can discuss chicken and egg, what comes before what? Do we first need to harmonize and clean up the act and codes and regulations before we could trade, or the trade will give an impetus for all of these things to be addressed? That is another discussion. Just to finish on that issue, is that, as you know from the World Bank, that the Asian Development Bank has been working for the last 2 decades on the Greater Mekong sub-region and bringing together. So what is that sub-region? Is the northern part of Southeast Asia, along with the southern province, Yunnan, of China. So we have 5 countries together, and they worked a lot on starting with the harmonization and the legal issues. And they stumbled 5 years ago when nothing happened after that, when they said, okay, we will now create a common regulatory entity. And this regulatory entity will be common and will help address this issue of varied regulations. And everything stopped because each of the 5 countries wanted it in their territory. And at the end, it stalled the project. It was not, the approach wasn't market-based. It was based on more of the same. Instead of bilateral negotiation, it was going to be a 5-party negotiation. But they did not introduce the idea of a market supply and demand on a regional basis. So yes, there is a lot to be learned from experiences that you mentioned of power pool around the world. But also there is a challenge of those working on the project to adapt it to the regional perspective, dynamics, and objectives.
With that, please join me in thanking this panel. And again, remain seated. I already stole 10 to 15 minutes from my the next panel. So what we'll do is you remain seated. We'll quickly change the speakers and moderator, and then get going with the next topic. Thanks so much.
Welcome back, everyone. If I could get everybody that's out in the hallways that can hear me back inside the room, that would be great. We had an excellent panel on the first half, and I'm pretty excited about my all-star cast that we have here with us for the second half. So I'm Karthikeya Singh, and I'm the Deputy Director of the Wadhwani Chair in U.S.-India Policy Studies here at CSIS. And it's my pleasure to be moderating this panel discussion. My own background is pretty heavily steeped on the India side of things. It's good to see a lot of former colleagues, former boss in the audience from the Department of Energy, where I did have some very practical experience in managing the bilateral energy partnership, and pleased to have a former colleague from the interagency here as well. The work that we look at on the Wadhwani Chair is a lot on subnational policies, and we'll see how some of that actually impacts countries' rankings in terms of their investment readiness, or how much investment they might be able to attract for deployment of renewable energy technologies or clean energy technologies. More importantly, I want to just say that I'm glad that it was mentioned in the last panel towards the end, or at least in the Q&A, examples from Africa. Because while we are focusing on the Indo-Pacific today, largely focused on South and Southeast Asia, if you look at the perspectives of countries like India, which are one of the key pillars of the Indo-Pacific as far as the United States is concerned, their perspective on what the Indo-Pacific is a little bit broader and perhaps slightly different than what the U.S. government considers. So spanning from the east coast of Africa through the Arabian Peninsula all the way up to Australia. And I know that we'll be focusing more on South and Southeast Asia today, but I'm glad that Africa was brought up. So on this session here, we're going to be exploring the financing scope and needs of clean energy projects, particularly renewable energy projects, and the role of governments, national, multinational development banks, and the private sector in meeting the financial need of these projects. Today, I am joined on this panel by Ms. Jane Summers, who serves as the Senior Energy Advisor in the USAID Asia Bureau, covering the energy and infrastructure development in Central, South Asia, and Southeast Asia. She's a professional engineer by training and has over 30 years' experience in clean energy, sustainable infrastructure, and pollution mitigation and capacity building. She has worked in many different areas, but I will just want to highlight that prior to USAID, prior to this current role, she managed global USAID's energy and environmental training programs and implemented a USAID technology transfer project in Ghana. Followed by Jane's presentation, we're going to have Ms. Hong Mai Nguyen, who's an energy specialist at the World Bank's energy practice based in Washington, D.C., with over 8 years of experience in planning, preparing, and implementing a range of renewable energy and energy access projects in Indonesia, Myanmar, and Mongolia, as well as improving governance of extractive industries and resource-rich countries in the Africa region. She comes with a wealth of experience here, and we're pleased to have her. And then finally, followed by Ms. Nguyen's presentation, we'll have Benjamin Attia, who's a research analyst in the power and renewables practice at Mackenzie, a global consultancy providing data analytics, market research, and advisory service across the energy sector, formerly with Green Tech Media Research. We're really looking forward to the presentation that you have in terms of some of the numbers that you'll be sharing with us. So thank you for being here. Given that we are we've eaten a little bit into this panel discussion, I'm going to allow the panelists to go ahead and dive in, and then we'll follow that up with a moderated discussion that I will lead and then open it up to the audience. So Jane, take it away.
Okay. So I'm with the U.S. Agency for International Development. I'm sure most of you are aware of what we do, but we are the U.S. government's development and foreign assistance agency. USAID implements the largest assistance projects for energy overseas, including in the Asia region. I'm going to start my presentation just by mentioning a new initiative which has been announced recently. So the administration's Indo-Pacific strategy, it advances a free, open, competitive, rules-based market approach to development, and it places energy squarely in the middle of this development model. On July 30th, the U.S. government, Secretary Pompeo, our Administrator Green, and a number of others launched a whole-of-government effort in the Indo-Pacific called Asia Edge, and that's enhancing development and growth through energy. Asia Edge is going to promote energy security, independence, and energy access. It will look at developing more resilient market-based policies, as well as assisting U.S. companies with advancing their products overseas in the energy sector. And USAID will play a pivotal role in leading with the State Department as well in this initiative. Asia Edge is going to focus on 4 different areas, looking at growing energy markets overseas, public-private partnerships, and fostering more business connections. It's looking at advancing market-based energy policies and market reforms by helping other governments set high standard energy procurement practices, more transparent market-based strategies. It's going to catalyze private capital for financing energy infrastructure projects, and that's what I'll focus my presentation a bit more today on that topic. Partnering with international finance institutions and private sector firms on financing and risk mitigation for projects. And finally, it will expand access to affordable energy and look at increasing reliable energy supplies for the region. So before I move on, I'll just say on Asia Edge, this announcement was just made. We're in the process of designing the programs which will launch this new activity, and it'll be run primarily out of our missions in the field. So now I'm going to transition to some of our existing programs at AID. So first I'll talk about a few of our regional activities. We have a program called Clean Power Asia run out of our regional mission in Bangkok. And the goal of that follows on some of what you heard in the previous presentation about connecting the region, primarily their power grids. So it focuses on cross-border trade, particularly increasing renewable energy resources into the grid. And we are working with NREL. You heard from Jaquelin Cochran in the earlier presentation on some of their work on how we're developing grid integration of these variable renewable energy resources. We also have a program called South Asia Regional Initiative for Energy, SARI, and I'll go into that program in a bit more detail in a minute. But that is a long-standing platform of 8 countries in the region looking at connecting their energy markets as well. In Central Asia, we have a program called Power the Future, which is looking at scaling up renewables. It is focusing right now on Kazakhstan and some reverse auctions there, which have already been started this year for renewables. And then finally, we've had a program called PFAN Asia for private financing network to leverage and mobilize a significant amount of resources for clean energy in the region. We have bilateral energy programs in 8 countries or missions in Asia. That list of countries could vary over the years, but in recent years it's been fairly stable. And then we have partnerships with a number of organizations such as USEA, NARUC, NREL, and some of the other Department of Energy labs. So we've been doing this work for several decades now in Asia, and so we're proud of some of the accomplishments we've made on these programs. I want to talk about some of the trends which are driving our recent activities and programs in the region. One is the demand for gas. USAID has been working in recent years primarily in the power sector, but we are getting more involved in the gas sector, doing some gas analysis on where the needs are right now in Asia, as well as some training programs on the gas enabling environment. The market for renewable energy is still very strong in Asia. There's a lot of demand, and the U.S. has a competitive advantage in some of these sectors, like smart grids and other areas of renewables. And so we have a big ask, I would say, for our U.S. expertise, state-of-the-art technologies, advanced energy and efficiency technologies. Developing country utilities have a need to transform the way they do business, just like developed countries have done so. So in the U.S., we've unbundled our utilities, so we don't have as very many utilities left that are still have generation, transmission, distribution all in one company, whereas many developing countries still have that model. So looking at making utilities more efficient as well as streamlining some of their activities. We're working on driving down on the cost of electricity in a lot of countries, particularly with reverse auctions for renewables, which we'll talk a bit more about today in this session. But other means of just allowing for a more level playing field for diverse energy sources to compete, rather than defaulting just to large hydro, just to coal or other large sources. But where does it make the most sense economically to develop some of these resources? And then finally, a new area that we're looking at to help bring some of these costs down is electric vehicles. Some countries in Asia that we work with have plans to dramatically increase some of their electric vehicles. This could be a nice fit for some of our renewable projects. So overnight, batteries can be charged for electric vehicles when the demand is low for some of the energy generation. I'm going to just mention some of the regulatory risks that affect investment in Asia. So Asia, unlike maybe Africa and some other regions, does not have as much of a financing issue. So financing is available in a number of countries in Asia. The issue is that are there obstacles to allowing that financing to come in? And in fact, can we make the regulatory environment incentivize more private sector investment and attract it to the region rather than making it difficult for companies to bring these, in many cases, lower cost projects online. So we work in the enabling environment sector for Asia, looking at where are the risks, where are the obstacles. Enrel talked earlier about some of the curtailment issues with some renewables, which of course is deterrent to private sector wanting to invest in places like India if they're concerned about their wind project being curtailed. So we're working with countries to try to remove these kind of barriers to private sector investment in the region. So I'll just talk about one of our regional programs, SARI. As I mentioned, there's 8 country members in SARI platform right now. It could expand to other countries. I would say of this list of 8, we work mostly in trying to connect 3 countries, which are India, Nepal, and Bangladesh. And there have been successes in this regional platform, although there is still not a regional market in South Asia. There is a fair amount of cross-border trade, but that trade generally is with India. So India with Nepal, India with Bangladesh, India with Bhutan, but they are not trading amongst themselves in that region. It's just cross-border bilateral trade. So we're trying to encourage a more open market for competitive power trade. We are now looking at maybe the potential for some gas trade in the region as well. But some of the successes under the SARC framework, we worked with countries to help remove some barriers to power trade in the region. India has been a leader, and we have been working with the Power Trade Corporation of India to to train some participants in the region, so bringing people from other countries in to learn from India's lessons that they've accomplished. We have supported analysis and pre-feasibility studies. One of these studies led to the development of a 500-megawatt transmission line between India and Bangladesh. That transmission line is expected to double its capacity to 1,000 megawatts. And we're looking forward to other projects of that type in India, which will really create and mobilize a lot of opportunities for investment in the infrastructure, for software, hardware, for these types of transmission line projects. So we think of it as a win-win for all countries. It will save money, and it will help bring technologies, much needed, more modernization to the region. So you've heard a bit earlier about India. I'll have to update my slide because now we're at 227 gigawatt goal for Prime Minister Modi by 2022 for renewables. Very ambitious goals. We're working to help India reach these goals. Of course, there's still 300 million people without access to electricity in India alone, which is almost the size of the US population when you think about it. It is massive. And so there is still a great need for energy in India, and I'll just use our work in India as kind of a case study for some of our work in Asia. As you'll see from this slide, as the solar capacity has greatly increased, the price of solar tariffs have come down about 75%. So over the last 7 years is a dramatic increase due to reverse auctions for allowing companies to bid against each other to deliver solar power at the lowest cost. And so that has really worked out well for India, and they're planning to expand that model. The level of investment in India alone that's needed for just renewables is very, very high. There's a lot of discussion about the cost of capital, currency risk hedging and all of that. But we have been working with India to try to attract more investment. There is investors, there are investors in India ready to invest in some of these projects, and international investors as well, as long as they can be sure that they'll get a good return on their investment. One of the projects we've been supporting is green bonds. Green bonds can help lower the cost for some of the renewable projects, and India has a desire to increase the amount of green bonds that are going to fund renewable energy projects in the region. Some of AID's work to support the issuance of these bonds has been to identify the challenges. $6 billion of green bonds were issued since late 2015, and India, the pipeline, they're expected in the next few years to issue up to $20 billion in green bonds. So we've been working to create an awareness among project developers, financial institutions, and government policymakers to the ability of this mechanism to help bring more renewables and meet Prime Minister Modi's ambitious goal, to establish a system for rating these bonds, to partner with the Climate Bonds Initiative on this activity, and support the issuance of hundreds of millions of dollars in green bonds. So we think this is a successful activity and is expected to grow over the years. I'm going to talk about some of our last mile financing for energy access. So this last mile means for those who may be close to the transmission line but yet don't have power, so they're close to the grid but still don't have access to that electricity. We're working on microfinancing of a network of clients that can be leveraged for the distribution of renewable energy systems at a very large scale, cost-effective manner. So we're working with up to 30 million microfinance institution clients in India, and this is the number of these institutions is growing annually at a large rate. We see that for reliability, there's a strong long-term relationship between the trust and level of these clients, and a good overlap between the microfinance institution base and some of the natural constituents you would see for energy access systems. For financing, we're looking at providing loans and ensuring affordability of these renewable energy systems, including reaching some low-income groups. So one of the activities has been partnering with 7 of these microfinance institutions. We've helped reach about 2 million household members with modern energy products and services across 9 Indian states. 100% of these clients and customers were women, and there was $22 million of funding leveraged in this activity. And then finally, I'll just talk about scaling up of some of our clean energy enterprises in India. We have an initiative called the Investment Readiness Initiative. It is looking at funding energy enterprises, so working with up to 30 social enterprises to help accelerate their services and investments for clean energy. The program includes mentoring and technical assistance to support these enterprises in their business plans, to help build relationships with investors, to help them find the right investments to put their money in, and to help scale these businesses. And we've reached about 1.2 million people for energy services with this investment mobilized. So I'll just summarize by saying USAID has many, many energy activities going on around the region. I'm happy to take any questions later, but these, I would say, under the existing administration, our energy programs are continuing and growing in a number of areas. With the Indo-Pacific strategy, we see that there's a long-term commitment to doing this kind of energy programming in the region. So thank you.
Thank you, Jane. I think one of the kind of inspiring things about, once we take a step back and look at the snapshot that you gave of the India case, is that the decades-long work that USAID has been undertaking in India in the energy sector is so broad-reaching and supportive of quite a rich ecosystem of stakeholders to actually support everything from green bonds for utility-scale type work to the last mile, because the need is so immense. And I know that on the energy access front, the USAID is a partner and trying to help the government meet the universal energy access target of 2019. We'll see if this administration can actually do it. But that is an important one for a country like India to deliver on those development promises. And that also requires, other elements in the finance ecosystem for that to be successful, particularly when you're talking about microfinance and things like that. The central government is certainly rolling out things like ensuring that people have bank accounts in order to get direct benefit transfer, to be able to use that money to purchase the kinds of technologies, energy technologies that they might need. So certainly important. And then important that you flagged a few of the key regulatory risks, because for a country like, again, not to just focus on India, but that is my own background, but payment delays and things like land acquisition, which are so incredibly important. For all of those elements, really, it's the state that's required. And I do have some questions for you, which we'll come back to, but for now, I'm going to hand the stage to Ben Attia.
Good morning. My name is Ben Attia. I'm a research analyst with Wood Mackenzie Power and Renewables, which is formerly Green Tech Media Research. Some of you might be familiar with that. We actually just kind of officially rebranded like 2 days ago, so a little bit of confusion, but same people doing the same stuff. We just have a lot more analysts, a lot more coverage, which is pretty exciting. So yeah, that's a little bit about us. We've got people all over the world studying all sorts of renewable technologies and power markets, and we've kind of combined our expertise in solar, grid edge, wind, energy storage, and power context to be able to sort of get a holistic picture of the energy transition. So that's some of the things that we've been up to. It's super exciting. What we've been able to do, and hopefully that'll inform a little bit of what I'm going to speak about today. So I'm going to kind of just go through some sort of market data that we collect, that we produce on a regular basis across a couple of our different research practices, just to kind of give you a little bit of context on financing, on bankability, and what the power mix could look like in the future. So I'm not the first person today to tell you that coal is still king in the fast-growing power markets of the Indo-Pacific. And right now, under the current trajectory, without sort of serious policy changes, we could see solar and wind comprising only about 13% of the region's total generation by 2035. As others have already mentioned today, energy demand specifically in the ASEAN region has grown by 60% in the last 15 years, and that's largely new build coal, mainly in Indonesia and Vietnam. So we're kind of able to sort of look at this from a few different perspectives and say, we do see rapid growth in solar and wind, but coal has not been unseated or seen as many early retirements as we've seen in other parts of the world, as we've seen here in the US and in Europe, as well as in China. And what we're seeing right now in Southeast Asia, one of those biggest, most important trends is simply just a policy transition, starting from a lot of FIT-driven markets or markets that didn't have really any policy framework for renewable energy whatsoever, transitioning very quickly from that to competitive reverse auctioning, which is a global trend in the solar and wind markets as well. But Southeast Asia, particularly, and sort of the broader Indo-Pacific region, has sort of been a little slower to that game than a lot of the other markets. And as a result of that, there's a lot of policy uncertainty in the region. There's sort of a lack of understanding of exactly how those transitions are going to take place, when they're actually going to happen, what they're going to look like, what that means for projects that are already in the pipeline. And that gives a lot of our clients a lot of sort of pause or unease about deploying capital into the region. And I'll talk more about that in a little bit. But as a result of that, if you guys are familiar with what has happened in the European markets in a transition from FIT-based systems to competitive auctions and subsidy-free projects, we saw a lot of boom and bust in some of the European countries, particularly in solar more so than wind. And we expect to see something relatively similar in the Southeast Asian region. China is obviously a sort of a grand scale example of that, as they're in the midst of that process sort of in stages right now across a few of their different procurement programs. So as a result of that, we're seeing some pretty significant cuts. The change in Chinese solar procurement policy that took place on May 30th, we expect that to actually cut about 20 gigawatts of total solar capacity across the world from our 2018 expectations, just as a sort of extreme example to that policy transition. So right now, if you sort of look out for the next 5-year horizon, these numbers do include China and India, which is why they're so much larger than a lot of other estimates you might see focused on ASEAN alone. And if you can actually notice that Chinese market share, both in solar and wind expectations, it's just about 2/3 in the solar side and over 80% on the wind side. But we do expect about $457 billion in CapEx-only investment by 2023 in the Indo-Pacific. And that's resulting in about 340 gigawatts of new solar capacity and 185 gigawatts of new wind capacity in the region. So as I said, there is a bit of boom and bust, particularly in the solar market. So you can sort of see that in our installation expectations for the next 5 years. 2017, obviously, China installed over 50 gigawatts of solar, which was quite unprecedented. That was over half the entire global market. We expect to see a pretty significant correction in that for 2018, and then again in 2021, as they sort of fully transition away from the feed-in tariff by 2020, when the NEA has determined that solar has reached grid parity, which we actually expect to happen before 2020. On the wind side, we see a bit more sustained growth. The vast majority of this is onshore, with the exception of about 20 to 30% of Chinese demand, which is in offshore, in the Fujian province mainly. And if you sort of look at these CapEx requirements between solar and wind in the broader region, sort of aside from China or excluding China, we're talking about at least $130 billion in CapEx-only investment by 2023. However, as has also been mentioned earlier today, policy uncertainty is really the biggest barrier to project bankability, particularly for solar. I spend most of my time working on solar, so I'll sort of focus on that here, but this is also mostly true for wind projects as well. So some of the sort of top levers that we've seen are, rule of law, contract enforcement, concession rights, sort of responsibilities for due diligence, ease of doing business and construction permitting, covenants and dispute arbitration. This is not unique to Southeast Asia, but something that we've seen most particularly in the Vietnam case, which I'll talk about in just a second. This has also been true in the Egyptian solar market. This has been true in some even European markets. Rights to payment, sort of the ability to structure and finance deals, bankable PPAs. Again, the Vietnam example is sort of the most prevalent, but these are sort of some of those top levers that developers and investors are looking to sort of find the right alignment of in order for them to be able to successfully invest in and deploy projects and capital. So down on the bottom of that screen there, we've just developed a bit of a scoring system or a bankability index for some countries in the Indo-Pacific region, just to try to sort of understand, what are some of these, what's a longer list of these levers and how do these countries sort of score. And if you'll notice, there's a pretty broad spread, but a lot of the sort of highest volume or highest demand markets for solar and wind projects actually rank relatively low on the scale. And part of the reason for that is there's sort of China as a, again, extreme counterexample, has the ability to sort of have command control regulation over the market. It's a very insular market. They have domestic supply chain on solar, for instance, about 2/3 of all module manufacturing for the entire world global market takes place in China. So that supply-demand balance between how much solar is being installed in China and how much solar is being manufactured in China is really key to understand what pricing and supply availability is going to look like in the rest of the global market. And that's true to some extent too for wind, not quite as much, but we see sort of some of those dynamics that might allow there to be exceptions to this rule. But in the ASEAN region in particular, in Southeast Asia, these sort of bankability levers have a really strong impact on the bankability and financeability of projects. And Vietnam is a perfect case study of that. So there's over 17 gigawatts of solar capacity alone in the Vietnamese pipeline. These are projects that are mostly in the pre-contract phase, spread across a few different regions. But these projects have, there's a pretty high attrition rate between projects that are in the pipeline and projects that we actually expect to be built. This is one of the highest sort of pipeline attrition rates, what we would call it, out of any market in the world. And part of the reason for that is simply project bankability. So you might be familiar with Vietnam's Decision 11 and sort of the soap opera maybe that ensued as a result of that. But now what's happened is developers have expressed a lot of interest, planned and cited and started to develop a lot of projects, but very few of them have reached financial close. There's actually, I believe, 2 projects now that have actually interconnected. One of them was just yesterday. The first one actually was right around the last time I was at CSIS. And our pipeline attrition rate is about 75%. So we expect a lot of these projects to really just never happen, or at least not happen within a 5-year horizon. So what the sort of policy environment looks like now, especially for utility scale projects. Sub 1 megawatt projects are quite a different beast because they're sort of exempt from MOIT permitting. So a lot of sort of local developers will start to focus on that segment of the market, particularly because it's sort of escapes a lot of these issues with the Decision 11 PPA. But what we'll see between the end of this year and the first part of next year is that projects that COD before June 2019 will get the feed-in tariff that was promised. It is denominated in the Vietnamese dong, which is pretty volatile compared to the US dollar. So there's some problems that come with that for developers. And they'll approve projects up to 50 megawatts, but larger projects than that require the Prime Minister's approval. So a lot of projects are coming in at 49.9 megawatts to sort of escape that. And then beyond that, what we'll see is a cut in the feed-in tariff probably for the second half of 2019 and likely into the beginning of 2020. And then towards the end of 2020, the Ministry of Energy is planning an auction system in partial collaboration with the World Bank and a few other folks. So we're not exactly sure what to expect from that yet. But there is sort of a transition underway, and because the PPA bankability issues haven't quite been addressed, we don't expect that a lot of these projects will move forward through financial close and start construction, at least through the 2020 horizon, but probably through the 2023 horizon as well. So sort of from the private sector side, which is where I come from as a minority in the panelists today, it's useful just to take a look at what sort of the global energy players are looking at. And this is, again, sort of an extreme case here to look at the oil and gas majors and their participation in renewable energy. But we just released a really snazzy study on this exact topic, so I'm going to talk about it for a little bit, if that's okay. You guys should also check that out. But yeah, so sort of on the extreme case here for the oil and gas majors, what we've started to see is that they're participating more and more in renewable energy markets. And part of the reason for that is because renewable energy projects have started to scale, not just as a market as themselves, but individual projects have scaled to such a point where they start to compete with some mid-sized upstream investments for CapEx and annual production. And that starts to put them on the radar of the oil and gas majors. Some of those folks who may not sort of be interested in smaller projects, may not have sort of the capital efficiency to be able to invest in smaller projects. But some of these larger projects in China, in Iran, in Kuwait, for instance, in the solar side alone, and then again in Norway and in the UK, for wind, and in China, of course. Some of these larger scale, gigawatt scale projects or close to that are starting to get on the radar of the oil and gas majors because they have a bit more capital efficiency in participating. And as a result of that, they're starting to think about what it looks like for them to invest in renewables as opposed to upstream assets. And what they've sort of come to understand, or we hope they've come to understand, is that renewables offer lower returns, in some cases quite a significantly lower return than upstream investments today, but they also have significantly lower risk. They basically have guaranteed between 5 to 7% IRR, whereas some of those sort of M&A activities or more sort of midstream or upstream investments could give them 15 to even 30+% IRRs in the short term, but have significant risk in the to 10 to 30-year horizon for those investments. And as a result of that, we've started to see some more participation from oil and gas majors in the renewable space, and they're able, because they have large balance sheets, because they have a huge amount of capital assets, they have the ability to actually attract pretty low costs of capital, and we've actually seen that that's not unique to the majors. So we expect that 92% of global wind and solar projects by 2023 will have a weighted average cost of capital that's less than 10%. And that's partially due to country dynamics, that's partially due to the maturation of the sector and our ability to predict generation, to bring down the cost of operations and maintenance, and of course capital cost declines, which have happened quite dramatically in solar, and will probably continue to happen, but at a slower pace, and similar for wind, but they still have a little bit more room to fall. We actually did another study that was pretty interesting a couple of months ago that focused on some of these ultra-low solar bids that we've seen recently, both in the US and in Latin America and in the Middle East, trying to just understand, are these projects viable? How are they able to bid so low? And how low is the price floor? How low can these bids really get before we start to have some real concerns about bankability, about the ability to complete these projects, and what kind of margins they might be earning? And an interesting finding of that was actually that for solar, we see that the price floor theoretically is about $14 or $15 per megawatt hour, which is kind of unthinkable, or at least was unthinkable not too long ago. But what's actually happened is that as there's been sort of an asset rotation strategy that's happened sort of in the development space, we're learning that developers are building projects able to earn a 5-ish% margin, 5 to 7% margin, and then offload the project to a pension fund or an insurance company, somebody that has tolerance for very low returns, but that are stable and guaranteed, which has been sort of characteristic of solar and wind projects lately. So that's sort of something that we see. There is still room for those costs to fall, which has been sort of a welcome news to some of our clients. Again, yeah, kind of talked about this already, but those equity IRRs on a global scale do range pretty significantly from solar, which again are about 6 to 7%. Wind we could see up to 8 or 9%, and then some of those midstream investments or upstream investments can go as high as 20 to 30% and above. So just a few key stats here. Solar and wind share of total generation in the Indo-Pacific could stay as low as 13% if coal sort of maintains its dominant position in the energy growth story, and particularly in ASEAN. We don't expect there to be really any feed-in tariff policies in place in the region post-2020. And we expect that there could be between $450 and $500 billion in CapEx requirements, including China by 2023, and about $130 billion in CapEx requirements outside of China. We expect that about 75% of the solar pipeline in Vietnam is probably not going to be interconnected, at least by 2023, as a result of the policy uncertainty that I discussed. And we expect that just about every solar and wind project by 2023 will have a WACC of less than 10%. And then just briefly some lessons here. For regulators and policymakers, policy uncertainty really kills your market. So make sure you have bankable regulations, consult with the industry when you're developing those, and look to successful case studies. You're not the first person to invent electricity markets, and there are case studies across the world of just about every sort of market design that exists that have worked and failed. So take a look at those as you're working out and developing regulations. For investors and banks, make sure you're looking at political risk insurance to fill some of those regulatory gaps as all these policies are being worked out. And extend your expectations for project development timelines, because in the midst of these policy transitions, a lot of things will sit for a while. So they're not going to happen on this timescale that maybe they should or they normally would. For international developers, IPPs, and sort of to the upper extreme, the majors, make sure you're driving towards larger projects, scaling up individual projects themselves, which can rival upstream investments, and assess that low risk, low return profile of renewables, and look at asset rotation as a way to churn through capital and reinvest those dividends. And for local developers, focus on the smaller segments, distributed generation. Again, in Vietnam, sub 1 megawatt projects can sort of avoid a lot of those issues. All you really need is a net metering policy, which is very simple. And then look to form consortia with larger players if you want to participate in the utility scale market, simply just because you can sort of gain their expertise, build a track record, and have the ability to win some of those projects, particularly in competitive auctions. So with that, I'll stop. We can open it up to questions, but hopefully that was insightful for you guys. Thanks.
Thank you, Ben. That was incredibly insightful. I mean, particularly the bankability composite score that you all have come up with. Having elements such as ease of doing business, dispute arbitration, rule of law, and contract enforcement, all critical to actually getting electrons flowing, getting these projects set up, but ultimately things that can cause uncertainty and drive fear in the investment markets. Also interesting to note that the weighted average cost of capital for wind and solar expected to be less than 10%. That's really, really interesting. Now, as a moderator, I do have a prerogative here to ask at least one or two questions before we open it up to the floor, but I'm also cognizant of where we are on time. So one question that I did want to ask that I can actually throw open to all of you, and I know that it'll resonate particularly with colleagues sitting toward the further end of the table, but I'd love your perspective as well, Ben, is to what extent are we seeing donor coordination amongst the multilateral development banks and the development finance institutions? So Jane, do you liaise with colleagues from other ally nations in projects that you are supporting in third-party countries? And to what extent is that overlapping with the efforts of banks like the World Bank? I'd love to hear a little bit on that. And one thing that we didn't really touch on that I think matters, particularly from an energy access perspective, because we're starting to see it happen, we've been seeing it happen for a little while now, is the role of philanthropic dollars. So foundations playing a role in this, in terms of setting up new types of funds, particularly in Africa and India and other parts, for project preparatory funds, for last mile access projects. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. And I have another question around innovation that I'll come up with next.
Yes, thank you. I would say on the donor coordination, USAID coordinates quite significantly with a number of donors. I would say it varies by country. So depending on the project and the country, it could be UK and DFID, it could be the Germans and GIZ, it could be the Australians and DFAT. So it just depends on the country and what they are investing in. So for example, if we're both investing in energy sector reform or power sector reform, then it makes sense to kind of leverage each other so we're not duplicating efforts. So we try to avoid that kind of inefficiencies between donors. Right now, there's a big effort to coordinate with the Japanese in the energy sector in the Indo-Pacific, and so we've had quite a few meetings recently with the Japanese to do that. As far as the development banks, we are collaborating with them in a few projects. One is the CASA 1000 transmission line project in connecting Central and South Asia. So that's a World Bank funded project where we actually run the CASA 1000 Secretariat out of our mission in Almaty, Kazakhstan. And the IFC runs the tender process, and we assist them with all the coordination between the 4 partner countries of Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Pakistan, Afghanistan. And it's a big effort, and I would say it's not easy, this coordination, but we have coordinated with ADB in other projects. So you mentioned the last mile question, but I'm not sure.
So that was really regarding, role of foundations and engagement with them as you do work in energy access space in particular, because we have seen an uptick of foundations playing a role in that space.
Yeah, I mean, we have on a select basis coordinated with foundations, Aga Khan and others that are working in the energy sector. But I would say that is probably a bit less than the donors and the banks. But yes, on some select energy projects we have coordinated with them. Thanks.
I want to quickly add to Jane's already very comprehensive answer on this. As I mentioned, there are tremendous financing need in each of these technologies in these countries. So we're better off coordinating with all the other donors to make sure that we support the governments in different segments of the market, or in different technologies, for example, or in the same but complementary ways. For example, in the geothermal sector in Indonesia, we have a donor coordination group that meets every quarter or twice a year to take stock of the government policies and to see where our advisory to the government could be in terms of improving the enabling policy frameworks for the sector.
I mean, I don't know if you have thoughts on this, but you certainly highlighted the role of oil and gas majors increasingly in investments into the renewable energy market. Do you see any interplay there in sort of at least observing how coordination's happening with multilateral development banks and DFIs? Do you have any thoughts on that?
And the majors?
Yeah.
Not off the top of my head, no. I mean, they've just sort of started. I think our finding was about 2% or just under 2% of total renewable energy assets are owned or have equity stakes from the oil and gas majors. So this is still a pretty new development. And most of the time they do already have pretty strong experience in developing regions. So they're typically able to, and obviously they have very strong balance sheets, so they're typically able to do it themselves. There may be some instances of that I'm not aware of, but it's not a trend.
Then I want to pull on one other thread that I saw actually in Hung, your presentation, something that I know that at least the U.S. government has supported and played an active role in the past, which is when you talked about the creation and development of new technologies, new clean technologies. So what are the ways in which different institutions, again, I know that probably Jane can speak to this a little bit, but certainly want to know what multilateral development banks are doing to actually support technology creation. We do know that several nations in the Indo-Pacific are part of the Mission Innovation Project. Everything, if we're to look at the broader Indo-Pacific region, Saudi Arabia, India, Indonesia, Australia, all key partners in Mission Innovation, and trying to do a baseline assessment of what they're actually spending on clean energy technology R&D in order to ratchet that up. And I mean, this is critical to go from nations that are simply trying to deploy technology to actually becoming creators of innovation and engines of growth in clean technology growth. So I'd love to hear any thoughts that you all might have in this space, and then we're going to open it up.
So one of the technologies that the bank has been supporting is on, or planning to focusing more on, is batteries. And here we channel climate funds to support project preparations. identifying the business model and the financing mechanism that would be appropriate for a particular country in starting to adopt some of the batteries technologies that has been in the market and trying to push the cost down.
Yeah, I would say in general, USAID programs support commercially available technologies. So we don't do a lot of kind of basic research or creation of new technologies. But that said, we do have a global development lab which focuses on disseminating innovative technologies overseas and looking at where the best applications for those new activities would be. It could be energy storage, but maybe things like right now AID is focusing on some digitalization, digital economy, mobile apps for pay-as-you-go energy services, things like that. So they are looking at some new technologies for getting energy access increased. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, I'm going to open it up to the audience to ask questions. So if you wouldn't mind saying your name and the institution you're affiliated with before you ask your question. And as Jane Nakano mentioned before, please ask a question. So we've got a gentleman over here with the glasses and a gentleman back there. We'll take 2 questions at a time if that's okay.
Excuse me. Thank you. It's a great panel. Mike Ashford from Comonics. Ben, and perhaps anyone else on the panel as well, Jane, or has there been any evidence of the reverse auctions coming in so low that it's actually deterring completion of projects and project closings in the pursuit of winning the bids? And is that material to the effort, or is it on average a beneficial development overall?
Great. Thank you for that. And we'll just take one more coupled with that. But Ben, I think that was directed at you, so hold that one.
Okay, Saad Bashir with the Export-Import Bank, and my question's about debt sustainability. There's somewhat of a concern of maybe like a fervor of building projects through this region, like too much too soon, especially when we're looking at like Chinese Exim Bank and other multilateral banks who are just trying to get in on the BRI, OBOR, all this massive kind of infrastructure building at the same time. So like, is there some kind of concern with countries' debt sustainability?
Great, excellent.
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, it's definitely something that the sector is aware of. There are not very many case studies so far. There are not very many case studies so far outside of India, which has some separate issues with sort of the reliability and completion of auctions. There have been a lot of cancellations and quality issues and things like that that have been tied to or are suspected to be tied to bids that are too low, where regulators, especially on the state level, have said, we'd rather try this again and get a price we know get a price for a project we know is going to get built. But that's sort of an indirect correlation. On a global scale, particularly with these sort of ultra-low solar bids that we've seen in Chile and Mexico, even in the US, in the UAE and Saudi, some of those sorts of bids, most of those projects are still too early stage to tell. And a lot of them actually have pretty long development timelines. So the Saudi project, as a counterexample, is supposed to interconnect by Q2 2019. So they've actually broke ground on it. Aqua is confident they'll finish it on time. On the sort of flip side of that, there's a project that used to be the lowest project in the world in Wilsona, California, that has an interconnection deadline of 2022, and that was bid, I think, 2.5 years ago or something like that now. And then the project in Chile that came in at just under $22 a megawatt hour, they don't even have to confirm the final technology mix between solar, wind, and storage until 2021, and they don't need to interconnect until something like 2023. So they bid for that capacity with a lot of sort of aggressive forward pricing assumptions, which we do see in most of those bids too. The Saudi example is a pretty extreme case study, or pretty extreme counterexample, which is why it was sort of so alarming for folks, is to say, wow, it's that low and it's supposed to be done by next year. Particularly in solar, it's true to a sort of slightly lesser extent for wind because the component mechanisms are a little bit more standard. But in solar, there's a number of different configurations, different sort of pieces of the supply chain that you can sort of make aggressive assumptions on. So we can say, we expect modules to be this far below, where we are now, we expect 15 to 20% reductions in module costs by 2022. We can say we expect, 10 to 15% in inverter cost reductions, racking costs, BOS, all this kind of stuff. So each of those, there's a lot of levers to flex. And some folks have said that they've sort of made extreme assumptions on too many of those levers. And we saw a correction in solar in module prices as a result of trade protectionism. We've seen corrections in the other direction as a result of changes in in the Chinese solar policy that have brought prices down much more rapidly than people thought. So it's a bit of a sort of a commodity market in some cases for some parts of solar, and that means that it's very difficult to sort of know what prices to expect in the future. So it's a little early to tell is the short answer. There aren't a lot of examples where outside of India where that has happened and the project has sort of fallen apart, but it still could happen. And there are a number of those ultra low bids in particular where time will tell. We'll have to see what else happens in the rest of the market to know for sure.
Yeah, and to answer your questions on debt sustainability, this is actually a real concern for some of our clients. And we're continuing to work with them through this challenge. And this situation creates the opportunities to examine the effectiveness of existing or previous investments. It allows for a refocusing on building policy and enabling a regulatory framework. And it also allowed us the opportunity to work with the government to craft a more creative financing mechanism or instrument or business model to strategically use public funds and combine with other sources to still bind down the cost of project development. So it's a great opportunity. That necessity is the mother of invention. So,
Jane, were you going to say something?
Yeah, so I would say on the renewable energy auction question, our experience has been that the first round of auctions prices come in, higher, and they gradually go down over time as developers become comfortable working in that country and can determine the risks. As far as learning lessons on those auctions, we have brought participants from Asia to Mexico and other places where auctions have been run to learn some of the lessons they had, good and bad, from running their auctions. So we're trying to do, I guess, what we would call South-South kind of lessons or knowledge management. As far as the debt sustainability question, I guess what I would say is where we've seen more issues is on large hydro and other large infrastructure projects rather than renewable projects being an issue with debt. Whether that's debt to the Chinese or anyone else. So I think the risk of maybe excluding, large hydro is a bit less on the renewable side, but yeah, it's still there. Thanks.
Just wanted to add one more quick thought on the sort of competitive auctions question. I've read and sort of had discussions with folks that have basically called, there's sort of two competing schools of thought on the sort of ultra low bids and their sustainability. One would just say it's a winner's curse and they've sort of locked themselves into a very thin margin project that's going to tie up a lot of capital, or maybe not happen at all. And then the other side of that would say, well, depending on the structure of the tender and the way that penalties for missing the deadlines or not completing the project on time or at all, depending on how steep those penalties are, developers may actually just be buying options to purchase projects and then waiting and seeing what happens in commodity markets. That's if the penalty is low and that sort of pencils out, then there are some instances in some tenders where folks have said, well, that's all the developer is really trying to do, and they can sit on those rights for a while. They could potentially sell them off if the structure allows, or they could take longer than they need to or not build it at all if it doesn't end up working. And that penalty could be relatively small in comparison for the cost of developing the project.
I think I can take more questions? I can take a couple more questions. If we have them. If we don't have them, oh, we've got one right there.
Hi, thanks to the panel. My name is John Lichtenfeld. I work with the Stimson Center and the Asia Group as well. I was just wondering if you've seen any difficulties arising from kind of potential for capital flight out of Southeast Asia or more of the emerging markets. Any risks associated with these projects from the Fed hiking rates, or are these projects on such a long timeline that they're somewhat insulated? Thanks.
I'll just say real quick, it's definitely a concern. Most of those long timeline projects are not in Asia at all. Actually, the Asian markets expect to build projects quite quickly. Some of them are very good at that, and some of them are not. China is an example of a country that's very good at building solar projects quickly. But yeah, I think it's definitely something that people talk about, but it's not really something that's materialized as an issue in the region yet.
Great. Well, I think thank you so much for an excellent panel discussion here on clean energy finance. I want to take a moment to appreciate our guests. Please join me in a round of applause for thanking them. They'll be around for for you to ask some questions, not formally on the stage, but I want to hand over to my colleague Jane.
Thank you so much, Kartikeya. And I just wanted to, on behalf of CSIS, I wanted to thank Pertamina again for this wonderful partnership that's putting a lot of spotlight on very important and timely topics. And also wanted to thank, again, Kartikeya from the India program joining us on the stage, and also Brian Harding and his team from the Southeast Asia program, as well as my colleagues from the energy program, Lisa Hyland, Ian Barlow, Stephen Namoli, and our wonderful interns, Nicole and George. Without your help, we couldn't have really put together a program like this with folks flying in from all over the world. And so again, thank you so much, and stay tuned. I think we aim to have many more discussions on a lot of energy-related important issues in the region. So stay tuned. Thank you so much again.